Okay, so this is the second video where we're breaking down the Declaration of Independence. And I guess that's it. We don't have anything else to say. So I will get into it. Okay, moving on to the complaints against George III. He has erected a multitude of no, we already did that one, I'm sorry. That was the one we just finished with. So he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Where armies occupy, martial law commands, and that's it displaces common law, and that's pretty much what we've seen here because we have been occupied since the Lieber Code. So they were unhappy with that. So the common law tradition is intolerant of standing armies because such an army tempts office holders to use it to spread martial law, the basest form of civil law, says Sam Adams, purely imperial. It commands obedience or punishment. So a standing military force with an overgrown executive president or executive branch will not long be safe companions to liberty. This means of defense against foreign danger have always the instruments of tyranny at home. So by contrast, the common law depends for the common defense upon the militia, armed ever present and ready to fall in ranks and fight, yet being no threat to freedom as our standing armies. So in addition, the professional soldier of the standing army tends more to fight for career and pay, and therefore to obey for pay, whereas the militiaman's passion for the fight focuses on hearth and home. Unlike a professional soldier, he is not career-minded and therefore less likely to obey an unlawful order. Bottom line, standing armies like career judges, prosecutors, and policemen, whether in peace or war, become result-minded administrators, impatient, even unwilling to protect personal rights. Thus, common law and scripture trust the jury over a government, paid judge, and militia over a standing army. So militias are better than standing armies, and juries are better than paid judges. Another complaint. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. So let's unpack that. King and Parliament were trying to avoid common law's time-consuming procedures called due process or the course of the common law with martial law commands. They're really pushing the martial law on the people. So as all forms of civil law, martial law tries to command the future, requiring immediate obedience. Common law, on the other hand, stresses finding the truth in light of past acts done. In short, civil law speculates what is right and commands it. Common law judges in hindsight, hence martial law, though needful in battle and preparations for war, must remain, as all civil law, subject to common law's due process. Next complaint. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. So let's dig into this. The Constitution, this 15th reference, is England's government limiting common law by displacing this Constitution with a law foreign to the colonists' Constitution. So King George and his cronies did away with the common law freedoms. This paragraph also accuses George of conspiracy, an agreement to commit a crime proven by actions aimed at completing that crime. Accordingly, our declaration here shifts from the lone pronoun he, King George, to he has combined with others, co-conspirators, fellow dependents of the central bank's trading and offshoot monopolies. The culprits, of the complaints from 15 through 24 are these co-conspirators. So whenever we talk about co-conspirators, it's the central bank. And then the 24th complaint, calling this cartel them, declaring themselves invested with the power to legislate. In fact, every abuse. So 15 through 24, every abuse cites it's one of the goals of George having combined with others, the bank cartel, by giving his assent to their pretended legislation. So as does the Federal Reserve Bank in our day, the Central Bank of England enjoyed monopolies on issuing currency, trade using the East India Company, and receipt of tax revenues to service its loans and to enforce taxation, all in violation of the English Constitution's common law rights against such monopolies. So in addition, this clause number 15 of the Declaration of Independence, shows two things. Not only did the colonists have a good constitution in their common law government, but also their zeal was keen to keep it pure from strange law pollutants, a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution. Namely, what was foreign was the admiralty or civil law, because it wasn't normal. So the colonial Americans' British brethren had the same zeal for the common law. For instance, on the 14th of November of 1770, the London Evening Post included the following against an English judge. In contempt of the common law of England, you introduce into this court jurisprudence unknown to Englishmen. The Roman code, the law of nations, and the opinions of foreign civilians are your perpetual theme. But who ever heard you mention Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights with approbation or respect? By such treacherous arts, the noble simplicity of spirit of our Saxon laws were first corrupted. So that those are Englishmen holding an English judge to account. So our war for succession with Britain's empire was to enjoy our English constitution, the same common law tradition the English demanded for themselves. In a word, our declaration says King George had conspired with the bank and trade monopolies to displace common law authority with civil law's admiralty power. I mean, that's huge right there. So sometimes you'll hear people commonly talk without maybe true comprehension that your forefathers just didn't want to pay their taxes. No, I think it was a lot more than that, because when you look at this, if the king is, conspiring with the bank and he is using monopolies to displace common law authority, I mean, the people were being abused, no doubt. So today, much as then, the federal government's, through gross overreaching of our Constitution's Admiralty Clause, uses admiralty law to control people and their property. Fundamental common law rights do not attach to matters within admiralty jurisdiction. Thus, government's unlawful use of admiralty law works to deny common law rights, such as the right to trial by jury, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, and the right to keep and bear firearms. And we don't call them firearms, we just call them arms. It's one of those semantic deceits. We have the right to bear arms, but them calling it a firearm is something different. So we don't say that word. Admiralty law, a form of civil law, is good and necessary when kept to its proper use to govern shipping, ships, and those activities in direct relationship to these, but is dangerous when used ashore. Legislation in the common law sense differs from the civil law sense. Common law legislation is by indirect consent of the governed through their representatives and by direct consent of the jury. So we as Americans, will have our public statutes, and they are created by the consent of the people by putting forth the representatives that truly as fiduciaries represent the American people. And then the American people can then look at those, and if something was done that is unjust, then we nullify it and we send it back. So that's how it's supposed to be with our federal American contractor. But right now we only have the foreign federal contractors. So we could still nullify whatever they do. Okay, the next complaint. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, there is no sure way to use civil law to dominate a people than to quarter soldiers in family homes. Making families take in soldiers and house them. Can you imagine having a stranger come into your house and you just have to live with them, someone that you don't know? Very, very odd to the peace of a family. The home is the refuge of one's heart and soul and mind. I mean, that's your space, right? So within its walls lies the family, true authority for self-government, the best health, education, and welfare institution of the world will ever know. By inserting British soldiers into homes, King and Parliament brought home and family, the building blocks of the colonial strength, under close surveillance. So you've got this foreigner in your house just really keeping an eye on you and everything that you say and do. Martial law and into total control. Without privacy in the home, government control of a people is total. Kind of like what they do with watching us on the internet and the NSA having the ability to, look at anything and you think something's private and it's not. I mean, everything that you put out there, even having your camera on your computer plugged in when you're not using it, they can still access it. They can still see what you're doing on your phone, So the weird people that they take their phone into the bathtub and they're sitting on it. You think that somebody can't see you on your phone camera. They can. I don't even think they think about it. So Without privacy in the home, government control of a people is total. In short, wherever soldiers occupy, martial law governs. In fact, soldiers quartered in homes become the very be quartered without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. The next complaint: for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. So, though soldiers are rightly under martial law, freedom demands that their murder of non-military men and women subject them to the common law courts and jury. And Georgia wasn't having that. So otherwise, government will use its soldiers to eliminate opposition with don't let your soldiers kill people. And no, in Parliament, we're keeping all such murderers from common law courts and in the martial law courts for protection from the jury, because we would have brought them to justice. Common law requires its courts to have final jurisdiction over the affairs of all civil law tribunals, martial, admiralty, administrative. Hence, in America, appeals from military courts are to the federal courts. Further, common law bars soldiers from being tried in these civil law tribunals for felonies done against non-military and non-clergy. In short, sailors and soldiers are all subject to the same rule of law and accorded the same rights of trial by jury as non-military. However, King George tried his soldiers and officials in his own civil law tribunals before judges dependent on him for their jobs and pay. Next complaint: for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. So here, our declaration cites King George's denial of the colonists' common rights of freedom of association, which includes freedom to contract and the inestimable benefits resulting from the free and unhampered exercise of these rights in trade and commerce. So King and Parliament had granted a trade monopoly to the East India Company. And you could see how this greatly benefits him. But if we're producing commodities that we can sell, we're not going to actually have free trade and be able to make a good profit if everything is being controlled. All the commodities are being controlled by the king. So the East India Company gets this trading monopoly, which at the time commanded a fleet of over 2,500 merchant ships and the protection of the British Navy and Army. The king and his cronies were invested in the East India Company and offshoot monopolies. They granted its corporate-like charter, outfitted the British Navy and Army to enforce its monopolies, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass people, or harass our people. And we were paying for these people. We were paying their salaries for them to abuse us. I say us because we're American. So monopolies of trade, being unnatural, are against the common law and therefore dominate only by unlawful government forced command. Okay, the next complaint: for imposing taxes on us without our consent. Yeah, the common law has always forbidden levying the taxes without legislative advice and consent. So in England, they had the House of Commons, where the common people would put in their 2 cents worth, and then they had the House of Lords, and that made up Parliament. And we weren't given any representation. Common law requires government to follow a certain process in order to tax the people. Next complaint: for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. And we're seeing it over and over and over again, how he would have his own judges in place, and how he would have his admiralty law in place, and how he would take away an area's ability to even structure a common law community. He was inhibiting common law everywhere that he could, using different avenues. Next complaint: for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. The common law tradition is against wholesale manufacturing of crimes by legislative decree. In short, if the behavior in question seriously injured no one, it is no crime. So that's a precept of common law. If there's truly a crime, where's the injury? Who is the injured? Who is the victim? And if no such victim exists, then there is no crime. The jury best recognizes crimes in hindsight, not some legislator attempting to control future behavior by speculating through administrative codes, decrees, and other legislation. So again, King George's persecutors were accusing Americans of crimes, but instead of respecting their right to be tried before a common law jury of their peers, each in his own colony and county, the king removed them to the civil law admiralty tribunals in England. To justify this atrocity, Parliament had resurrected an ignored statute that Henry VIII, of course, had signed over 200 years before. Henry VIII was a real piece of work, wasn't he? Okay, next complaint. They're upset with him for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. So, the British government's replacing of American common law courts with admiralty tribunals are a direct act of breaking faith with British Americans. Here, however, the signers refer to the king and his cronies' indirect plan to displace common law protections with civil law inquisitions by having made official in Quebec Roman canon law. Then, intending to extend that civil law, which demands none of the common law rights included in our Constitution's Bill of Rights, into the British American colonies to the south. Almost 19 months before, on October 14th of 1774, the threat of this scheme moved the colonies to form our first true Congress. Having detected the plot, Congress gave the color and cry. So Parliament's Act establishing the Roman Catholic religion in the province of Quebec, abolishing English laws and erecting a tyranny there, to the great danger from so total a dissimilarity of religion, law, and government of the neighboring British colonies, by whose blood and treasure the said country was conquered from France. So by the words, so total a dissimilarity of religion, law, and government of the neighboring British colonies, Congress refers to the king and his cronies erecting a tyranny using Roman civil canon laws, inquisitorial government in Quebec, the neighboring province. The words, the assistance of whose blood and treasure the said country was conquered from France, refers to the British American colonies giving of wealth and lives during the French and Indian War. A great struggle for supremacy, says Coffin, between two races, two languages, two religions, and two systems of law. Through that struggle, Britain conquered Quebec, ridding the New World of France's Roman law priestcraft inquisition. So here they fight the French and Indian War to get rid of France and get them out of there and get rid of the Roman law that they're pushing in their priestcraft. And then this horrible King George turns around and wants to insinuate that himself. So at the final showdown on the plains of Abraham in Quebec, the armies of Britain and France decided the fate of the continent by battle in favor of the common law. But now, says our declaration, King George has reestablished Rome's arbitrary religion, law, and government in Quebec. Really bad guy. All right, let's see how many more we have. We have a lot. All right, let's get to it. For taking away charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. So America's earliest founders, English Puritans, Reformed Dutch and Germans, Scotch Irish, Presbyterians, believed the promises of Scripture were a species of common law contract called covenants. These covenants, they said, were the stuff that held together the common law government by consent of the governed. Further, where the governing party breached such a covenant, the relationship ended. Indeed, the law of contracts, that is, the law of promises, is the guts of the common law. So thus, in order to have a lawful government, our first fathers requested and received charters from the crown ensuring their common law rights, including the rights of local government. And these charters, being promises, common law recognized and enforced, were contracts. Because the crown breached these contracts, the common law released colonists from allegiance to the crown. So the complaint was for taking away charters and abolishing our most valuable laws and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, meaning he broke his contract with them when they got a charter for him to start the colony in the first place. Next complaint. for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So again, the people are just losing their ability to self-govern. Common law requires a self and local government, and he's taking that away from them and he's imposing on them. Next complaint. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging wars against us. So let's see what this is about. King George, by declaring the colonists out of his protection, condemned them under common law's outlawry, the sentence of death pronounced, right, Pollock and Maitland, where there are no police constables or professional hangmen, to pursue the outlaw and knock him on the head as though he were a wild beast, the right and duty of every law-abiding man. In fact, the colonists sought the king's favor and reward by turning in the outlawed patriots, hunting down and killing them. King George sent his army and mercenaries to murder them. In short, George meant his declaration of outlawry against the Americans to get them clean outside the protection of the common law. To even harbor the outlawed was unlawful, thus the common law called him an outlaw. However, according to common law's outlawry, even the king's false declaration was not enough to justify the colony's separation from him. To be sure, the king's declaration put loyal colonists in real danger. Separation, however, demanded that the colonies show real injury, and complaints 26 through 29 fills that bill, while complaints 2 through 24 show injury by indirect means through deceit, scheming, manipulation, and abusive working of the courts and law. 25 complaints, 25 through 29, show direct, open-handed, and notorious acts of war, murder, kidnapping, plundering, and terrorism done in treachery and cruelty. So we didn't learn about that in grade school, did we? I mean, we should have heard all about this. They really need to teach this to the kids. British records of British murder of colonials reveal merciless brutality, hunting down colonial patriots as though they were wild beasts to be killed for sport. Really seriously messed up. Because King George had bound himself to the colonies and they had to him, by denying them protection of the common law, he broke faith. The colonies were, therefore, within their rights, even duty-bound, to break loyalty with him. See, they always shoot themselves in the foot, don't they? So he had plundered our seas, ravaged coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Comment. These accusations are strong, yet true. In a word, the British had reverted to the brutalities of the early Scandinavian immigrants, and as any other government, the only tool king and parliament had to dominate her colonies was force and threat of force. Indeed, says Washington, government is neither reason nor eloquence, but force. If a people, however, refuse to knuckle under such tools of statecraft, government has no other tool but to ratchet up its force to the level of brutality. Next complaint, number 27. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstance of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages, and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. So the Haitians, he was sending Haitian mercenaries over, and the mercenary is a combatant hired, leased, or lent out to fight in a foreign war. This civil law state claims absolute power over its military, draftees, trafficking in their lives and services, selling, leasing, and loaning its soldiers. So the use of mercenaries, though found in the history of common law countries, has never been a part of common law tradition. The mercenary fights on command for profit. By contrast, the non-mercenary fights for his rights and those of his family. So this clause refers to the circumstances of cruelty, perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ways, because king and parliament, daunted that they were unable to subdue the colonies with threats and shows of force, laid plans of terrorism. So if they couldn't just bully them, they were going to terrorize them. They were going to infuse the smallpox virus into the colonies through the slave population. General Washington, having learned of this barbarity, having himself had pox, vaccinated the Continental Army, knowing that 10% of his men would die from the vaccination. But knowing also, so he got them sick on purpose, kind of like the way that moms would take their kids over to play with the kid that had chickenpox. I mean, that's what he did. He went ahead and gave it to everybody. So when they say vaccinated, they didn't have vaccinations back then, but he created immunity by going ahead and giving it to them, and he knew some of them were going to die. But knowing also that without it, the Brits germ warfare would kill 90%, because at most when they got it, they would just be disabled for about 2 weeks, and they would have scabbing and general discomfort. All right, so moving on, smallpox. It's another complaint. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends, brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. So let's unpack that. So here our declaration charges King George with common law kidnapping, slavery, and murder, all felonies justifying the meeting of force with force. George's decree of outlawry in complaint 25 had duty bound every able-bodied man to kill any disloyal to him. To aid or harbor an outlaw is to be outlawed also. The king offered relief from outlawry to any willing to kill their outlawed friends and kin, as the weak-hearted, turncoated viciousness grew. All right, we're almost done. Another complaint. He has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of everyone. So the French Jesuits for decades before had falsely incited the Indian tribes against the New England colonists, and then led these indigenous people to murder of men, women, children, elderly, and the crippled. So now the British were attempting to incite the tribes against the colonists, but with little success. In fact, the tribes often fought with the Continental Army, proving their skill at warfare, striking into the redcoats' hearts fear of the red man's bow and tomahawk. The British had more successful inciting to insurrection, colonist against colonist. So in some, complaints 3 through 29 lists the criminal charges against King George and co-conspirators, showing that he is unfit for office, justifying the colony's secession. So complaint 30, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petition have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be a ruler of a free people. So this is pretty self-explanatory. I don't think we really even need to unpack that. I mean, they're asking and petitioning for redress, and he continuously injures them. And they're like, this is not the kind of man that is going to, rule us as king or, be our king. This man is a tyrant. Like, he really is terrible. So the next final complaint 31, it might be the final one. Nope, there's 32. Yeah, we have 2 more. So nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce to the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So the colonists, by exhausting their appeals, followed due process. I mean, they really tried to give notice and, contact him and talk to him and do this peacefully. And he just kept getting more forceful, like a tyrant. British Americans, feeling the natural affection of their kinship with the people of Britain, had appealed to them in vain, as well as to the parliament, reaching out to the people, reaching out to the parliament to basically convince the king to just chill and, be more peaceful with the colonists. But remember, because England believed her soil was free, they really looked their noses down at the colonists. Our declaration appeals to ties of common kindred, indeed. In some, the king had violated the colonists' covenants, unwritten and written, stamped by their creator on their natural desires and put into writing by their colonial charters. So, it was all around awful. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right to do. And for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. To sum up, America justifies its founding foremost upon our forebears' direct appeal to their personal creator, judge of all in heaven and on earth, by passing every mere government of men. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. So that is all of the complaints. And by using the name divine providence, the signers reveal more of the God of whom they spoke in the first paragraph, upon whom they rely and to whom they now appeal. In that day and yet today, to acknowledge divine providence is to recognize the Creator's ever abundant provision. Scripture calls God providence and provider because he will fulfill all your need. Philippians 4:19. God outfits a people for his purposes, which among the British American colonists was for war and self-defense. So that, folks, is our breakdown of the Declaration of Independence. And our next one is going to be really breaking down the Constitution.